All right, I lied. It's going to be weekly, not bi-weekly, at least for now. I should also mention that to set this up, I had to create an email address that I could use as a login. So relationalpodcast@gmail.com. That's mine, and if you wanted to respond to something you heard, you could email me there. I don't check it that often, so you might have to wait a while. And then Libsyn, who's housing the podcast, they have these little one-click features to announce episodes on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and some other platforms. So I made a Facebook page and I made a Twitter handle, that's Relational Pod, and then I made a YouTube channel. And so if you find it more convenient to learn about new episodes or to obtain new episodes from any of those, you can go looking for those. What I want to talk about this week, I want to talk about criticism. I've spent the past several months with growing urgency and alarm thinking Donald Trump has no business being president. Why can't these other people see it? But then I also know that there are a whole lot of people out there who've spent the last 8 years saying to themselves, what Barack Obama is doing to the country is bad for the country. Why can't these other people see it? So this is me house cleaning my thoughts about criticism. These thoughts are a work in progress, and I'm not sure they're going to add up to anything, but this is where I am as of today. The first thing, I have this very, very strong feeling that we have had entirely the wrong idea about government. We've been thinking about government and about office holders in ways that are not productive. And the first thing about that is private schools look a lot better than public schools because private schools get to have admission standards, whereas public schools have to educate whoever shows up, no matter what their income level, no matter what their academic preparation, the quality of the parenting of the child, the health issues, mental health issues. Public schools got to educate them all. And there's so much enthusiasm for people from the business world becoming political office holders, and I'm pretty skeptical and pessimistic about that being a good idea, because in the business world you get to choose who to do business with, and you get to dissolve partnerships with other businesses, and you can even fire customers if you want, but an office holder can't ever do that. Even the people that we regard as at the bottom of our whole civic order, the people that we lock away in prisons, I mean, you still have to feed and clothe them and provide them with medical care. Going back to my baseline idea that hatred is not okay, anybody who is within the territory covered by the political unit, you got to take care of. And even, I think, being the mayor of a small town, any position that you take, any idea that you speak approvingly of, and definitely any proposal that you try to push, if it satisfies one person, it's going to go against the legitimate interests of another person. And when your small town grows to the size of 300 million people, every word that comes out of your mouth, you have to thread the needle. You have to navigate this maze of interests. And we've had in the past, in the history of this country, some really exceptionally wise and eloquent leaders who have done a pretty good job. And we look back on them nostalgically because with the long view of history, we don't remember their bad days anymore. But the problem has continued to grow as the population of the country has grown and as the problems that people face have become more complicated. And I think really we had to reach a point where we could no longer keep up with the growth. And I'm not sure that we've reached it, but I worry that maybe we have. So I think that when people complain that office holders, they talk a lot, but they don't say anything. They talk, but they're mealy-mouthed. And it's all focus grouped, and it's all bland, and every time you hear them talk, you feel like it's the same old, same old. I think that's a little bit like watching sports and complaining that the athletes are sweating. Well, sweating may be distasteful, and it'd be nice if there was a world in which you could be an athlete and never get sweaty. Getting sweaty is a byproduct of engaging in just about any kind of intense physical activity, and speaking in language that doesn't fully satisfy anybody is kind of a necessary byproduct of holding together a government that can do a good enough job of maintaining social order and providing the most urgent needs that a government really has to take care of. Another wrong idea I think we've had about government is I think we're way, way, way too quick to call opposing politicians liars. I think we're way too quick to complain about their talking points and to dismiss them, because everybody in every line of work in one way or another advertises. I, from time to time, am in a position to pitch the college that I teach at. And could someone from another college, if they were motivated enough, if what I did came into their living room and if they felt the stakes are high enough, could they call me a liar? Yes, and I could call them a liar. We don't tend to get that heated about it, but politicians, they take a side, they have objectives, and they do pretty much the same thing that the rest of us do. They advertise, and all advertisement necessarily is partial. And people who advertise for products that you don't like, that doesn't make them liars. They are making the best case they can, and they are aiming at their target demographic. Now, I think segmenting the electorate into target demographics, I think it's necessary. I don't think anybody could run a political campaign without doing it. I think trying to come up with appeals that would be appealing to everybody would be so bland they would be completely meaningless. But I also think that one of the byproducts of identifying who are your voting blocks, I think that some of what comes from that, that's part of the whole, this person's a liar, but it has some other problems as well. Okay, I'm starting to get tangled up in my thoughts. I don't think all of the above means that we need to let office holders off the hook. The fact that they've got a big job and have to appeal to a lot of people with a lot of interests, that is the problem that they signed up to tackle. I think that we need to get better at being properly critical. So I've spent the past 8 years listening to unbroken, uninterrupted hostility against President Obama, and longer than that, hearing unbroken, uninterrupted hostility against liberals, which I'm doing air quotes, which the microphone doesn't pick up. And I myself have from time to time been labeled a liberal and dismissed, even though you might be surprised to find out how many political viewpoints I have that don't fit neatly with that label. But I think, how much more seriously would I take it? People who dismiss me in that fashion, I kind of dismiss them as well, because it doesn't feel as though, if someone wants to just write me off as a liberal, it doesn't feel as though there's a lot of potential to have a conversation. But what if what I saw instead was someone who could recognize the occasional position that I took that they saw merit in, that they could other times say, well, I disagree with you, but I can see where it's a reasonable disagreement, and then at other times, if they had really, really sharp resistance and said, this is the issue that matters to me, then if someone did that to me, and I knew that they positioned themselves very far down the political spectrum from me, I would take them a lot more seriously. I'd have a lot more respect for what they had to say. And if that's true, then maybe that's what I need to do for the people, for the voting bloc that won this last presidential election. Instead of it just being a barrage of looking for the next negative thing I can say, looking for the next blow, the next uninterrupted, hostile, dismissive, oppositional remark, could I find the positions where I think they're correct? Could I identify where I disagree, but I think it's a reasonable disagreement? And could I save my firepower for the issues that genuinely are issues of urgency? I think that that really is what I need to do. And I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I think uniform hostility, this uninterrupted hostility, has 4 factors driving it. There are 4 driving forces that make this happen. The first is, I genuinely believe that in part it's a political strategy, because keeping people divided and segmented is in the interest of the leadership. Now, a lot of times people say that and they mean it in a very ominous fashion, that it's tyrannical. I don't think that's true at all. Really, I think it's about predictability. I think it's because wave elections, when people from very different backgrounds all see that their interest is in common, I think that those, if you are someone who has put in the time to learn how to be an effective office holder, wave elections are like Category 4 hurricanes coming through. I think all of us in our professions try to find predictability. Predictability is good for us as individuals, and I have some compassion for people who take on a life of public service and they want a little bit of predictability. I admit in my line of work I want a little bit of predictability, and I am not perfect about responding in an observant and spontaneous fashion to every single turn of events, that I come up with some recipes and some formulas and some profiles that help me limit how much adapting I have to do second to second. And so when political leaders create safe congressional districts, yes, I think that it's one of the things that's dysfunctional. I think it's one of the things that trips up public deliberation. But I understand why they do it. And they don't do it because they're trying to make my life worse. They don't do it because they hate the country and want to bring it down. They do it because they have a very, very human wish for predictability. The second thing that I think is a factor behind this is the media. And it's a fact, and not a fact that I think most media decision makers are happy about, that long-form media is a very, very niche market. And most mediated products, if you're going to be able to run your business, if you're going to be able to make payroll and take care of all the people who depend on you for their livelihood, what you have to do is you have to present a whole lot of programming that never gets down to the details, and that it has something built into it that draws attention. In long-form journalism, I think you can report on political controversies and talk about cooperation and negotiation and who are the players and what are the interests behind them and where might they line up and what surprising actors get involved on surprising sides. But for the daily newscast, if it bleeds, it leads. And so you're going to edit down a longer message with more nuance to it down to the soundbite that you think is going to make people tune in, feel outraged, feel awakened, and in some way that they got to vent some of the frustration that they bottle up from a lot of other areas of their life, and then they're going to tune back into your newscast because whenever they watch your newscast, they feel that sense of awakening. Now, it may not be a pleasant sense of awakening, it may be an angry or a scared sense of awakening, but that's what brings people back to watching. The third thing that I think is going on, apart from leadership promoting it and the media business model promoting it, is the difference between face-to-face communication and mediated communication for the listener, for the observer, the end audience. If I ever were to meet Donald Trump face-to-face and I were in the same room, I think that, I've heard that face-to-face, he's actually very, very gracious and he contains himself. Chiefly it's when he gets in front of crowds or when he is handling his Twitter feed, when there is distance between himself and the people that he addresses. That's when he says a lot of the things that really shock me. I think if we were in the room together, then there would be a lot more promoting civility between us. Where you lose the face-to-face connection, if you think about what causes road rage, if you think about the kind of bile you read if you ever make the mistake of reading YouTube comments, loss of face-to-face and immediacy, that's a reason that throughout history, leaders have been lightning rods. That's a reason that people tend to complain so sharply about leadership. We know our president's name, we hear our president's words, we carry out our lives under our president's decisions, but almost all of us never meet the president. And even if we do as a quick little ritual and snap a picture, we don't get to know the president as someone that we can talk to in an interpersonal environment, face-to-face in the same room. Now, if you take that effect, the fact that we only have mediated connection, that they have this huge influence in our lives, but we only have the distance through which those messages have to travel. And then you take the things that they say, and the media picks out the sound bites that are going to accentuate hostility, then that magnifies that effect. So the leaders want to keep us in opposing camps that have hostility to one another. The media cherry picks what will sharpen and accentuate that hostility, and then the fact that we are experiencing these emotions, these sensations with people that we never get to be in the same room with. Last of all, I think that unbroken hostility can seem rational to us if we don't think all the way through what it accomplishes. So someone wins office, someone is the mayor, the governor, the president, and they're from the opposing political party, and it can feel to us like what we've got to do is just hammer and hammer and hammer, and one complaint has to follow another, because if we just find the big enough hammer, it's going to break through all the resistance, it's going to crumble this enemy of ours, we almost have a duty to do it, but that is simply untrue. And the idea that has been the most powerful idea to me, that has been the idea that's stayed on my mind the most, is we have neglected the relational dimension. We have tried to make too much rest on content. And content is not going to get us where we want to go. Now, there are problems with unbroken hostility. Let me talk about those for just a couple of minutes. The first problem I have with unbroken hostility, whether it's other people's unbroken hostility to a candidate or an office holder I support, or my unbroken hostility to an office holder that I oppose. The first problem is my faith. And here I have to introduce the concept from social sciences, primarily psychology, of attribution. When we see other things that we believe are brought about by human behavior or human decision making and there's ambiguity involved, we come up with explanations. We come up with, is that the person's personality? Is that the person's choice? Are those factors beyond the person's control? We weigh all that in our minds, and we do it to our own behavior too. But there's ambiguity involved, and there are multiple possible interpretations. And I've lost who I first got this idea from, so I'm going to credit it to Bill Strom from Trinity Western University up in Canada, because I believe he was the secondary source I got this from. But really what we ought to be doing, and what my faith teaches me, is I ought to be practicing gracious attribution. Where there are multiple motives possible, I should be picking and choosing to believe the one that's easiest to forgive. Now, when I teach this to my students, I use this illustration. You're out driving in your car, and someone cuts in front of you, and they do it so suddenly that you have to swerve, and you feel very scared, very startled, and you feel like you almost had a wreck. And what typically happens? You get angry. Well, if you take that 1 second and think through all the possible explanations, what happened? It might be that they just didn't see you. It might be that they're playing on their phone. It might be that they just think they're better than you, and if they want that lane, you just need to get out of the way. Or it might be that they're rushing a family member to the hospital. Those are all possible explanations, and if you can't see into the car, and you can't gather much information about what that person is doing, you don't know which one of those is the correct one. So it's not easy to do in all situations, but it's definitely doable. Pick an interpretation that is forgivable. And forgiveness, my faith teaches me that forgiveness is important. But even if you don't share my faith, there's all kinds of evidence. There's a powerful body of evidence that holding on to resentment is really, really unhealthy, really poisonous. And picking the path that makes it easiest to let go of resentment and forgive is a really, really healthy choice. So I'll get to the end of this by saying what I think we do with people that we oppose in public life, we do the mirror image of it. We don't even do neutral attribution. We do malicious attribution. Every time we become aware of an office holder we disagree with, we whip up what gathers our awareness, their comment, their decision, their behavior, into the worst explanation possible, the most hostile explanation possible. And really, I should be practicing gracious attribution, not malicious attribution. That's the first reason. The second reason that I think unbroken hostility, that there's a problem to it, is that it's inaccurate. It is just fundamentally, flatly inaccurate. It reduces complex human beings to caricatures. Now, we know there's the evidence on this is very powerful. We tend to think of people who belong to groups that we dislike as having very simple reasoning, very simple wishes, and a very uncomplicated emotional life. We tend to find it very hard to believe any group that we don't like has ambivalence. We tend to not believe that they have complex ideas. We tend to reduce down their ideas and their feelings to real simple crayon sketches. And that's just flat not true. Donald Trump doesn't have the kind of life he's had without there being a lot of complexity to him. And more importantly, and I don't want to keep making kind of the sloppy stumble of making this about Donald Trump, voters who support him, they are not simple in their emotions. They are not simple in their motivations. All of these are mixed and complex. And so if I'm hostile only every time I become aware of a Trump voter, I take the Trump voters' reasons and the Trump voters' behaviors and spin them as negatively as I can, then I am really, really being sloppy in my thinking, and I need to do a better job than that. The third problem I have with unbroken hostility is that it's ineffective. It doesn't reach anybody at all. It's content that poisons the relational channel. And if there's one thing that's true, the relational dimension, if your relational instincts run counter to the content that you're receiving, you'll tune out the content. A steady diet of attack doesn't change anyone's mind. You can't change people's minds by proving or disproving. The way you change people's minds, well, first of all, you change people's minds by being open and vulnerable to having your own mind changed. And what you've got to do is you've got to build trust. Uniform attack does one thing. It doesn't disprove, it just shows hostility. And it makes very clear group identity. And some of the work done in my field talks about how if you and another person interact, and really what you focus most on is your individual identities, you're likely to find some commonality, and you're likely to be able to do what we would call converging. You're likely to be able to achieve some relational closeness. But every time the thing you think about the most is your group identity versus the other person's group identity, what you're likely to do is to retreat into your groups and let the distance between those two groups separate you. And that's when a lot of what you want to help the other person see is likely to get lost, because they'll filter it through that group identity. The more I can show respect for people who don't see the way I see, the more I can lay the foundation and invite them to genuinely, authentically listen. So what? So what should I do? Well, the first thing is I shouldn't come up with rationalizations and perspective moves that minimize their best qualities. If they've got best qualities, that's what I should pay attention to. In the past, a few times I have, and actually I do it today, sometimes with difficult students. When I have a student who's really difficult, one of the first things I learned a long time to do is to catch him being good. Not to get caught in this cyclical, escalating habit of just latching on to everything they do that brings up my negative feelings, but spot them being good, point out them being good, thank them for it, and affirm them in the things that they do that I like. And that typically builds a bridge between us. And they may still do some things that drive me up the wall, but at least I can balance it. And then, I'm sure I do things that drive them up the wall, and then we're both just human beings with our merits and our flaws. The next thing that I can do is I can think hard about what's happening outside my view. What are they doing that I never see? If you ever get tempted to think of a person as a caricature, if you find yourself falling into the error of being one-dimensional, just think, what is going on behind closed doors? What is going on around the corner? I guarantee you there's something going on in their life that if you saw it, you would see them in another light. And very often, the things that people hide away, those are the things that would give you a lot more compassion. It could be that there are good things that they do that they don't want attention drawn to, but a lot of times there are things that they struggle with, there are things that are difficult for them, and if I knew about those, my heart would break. And there's a large part of that's a future episode. The next thing that I can do is I can remind myself, my neighbors, my fellows, my peers are a lot more interesting to me than Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is eternally Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is the people who voted for him. But I can affirm a few things about that. People who voted for Donald Trump are not stupid. People who voted for Donald Trump are not evil. I am not stupid. I am not evil. I am not better than they are. They are not better than I am. They sized up their options and they picked the one that fit what they wanted the best. I sized up my options and I picked the one that fit what I wanted the best. And if I disagree with the choice that they made, my burden, my responsibility is to reach out, to engage, to teach. And if I'm going to try to teach, if I want to do an effective job of it, I have to pay attention to the relationship. And I also have to be teachable. Because outside of a classroom, it's not teacher to student. Between neighbors, it's really fellow teachers. It's colleagues educating one another. Now, one of the things, this started off being about criticism. It's drifted a little wide of that, but I actually teach a class in criticism. And when I teach criticism, I start off the first class meeting, I ask, is the movie critic allowed to like the movie? Is the restaurant critic allowed to like the restaurant? Because criticism is a word that we know in multiple senses. There's the sense in which being critical, you expect to hear something negative, something that feels like an attack. But there's a sense in which complete criticism, well done criticism, can be a revelation, can be really, really wonderful to listen to. It's kind of like the word argument. A lot of people are terrified of getting into an argument. But if you had your two dream jobs put in front of you to where you almost couldn't decide which one you wanted to do because they were both so wonderful, well, if you started to list the arguments in favor of each one, all of a sudden the word argument doesn't sound so bad. So when we get to talking about what criticism is, I say, well, if I'm a restaurant critic and I say, hey, this place is good, you should go, am I going to be a restaurant critic for very long? And they agree, no, I'm not, because what I need to do is I need to go through all of the details, all of the elements that when they go, it's possible they won't notice right away because I do this all the time and I'm educated in it. Same thing in being a film critic. I need to point out the subtleties, the nuances in that film. But then I ask my students in this criticism class, well, what if I do that? What if I do this really, really thoughtful, incisive analysis of whatever I'm criticizing, and then I get to the end of it and say, oh, but is it good or not? I don't know. I'm just not a very opinionated person, and that's the end of the column. Am I going to be a critic for very long? And the answer is no. You're not going to be a critic very long if that's what you do, because criticism is about being careful and combing through the details, but using those in support of a judgment that is nuanced. So if all you do is heap praise on a restaurant or a film, it becomes fawning, and fawning is not good criticism. And if all you do is point out everything that's wrong with it, then it's trashing, and trashing is not good criticism. But if you can take the strengths, and if you can take the limitations and the unrealized potential and put them in perspective, and you can come up with a judgment that is, this is a solid work of art, or this has fallen from where it used to be, but it has the potential to come back if some things get changed, or this is ambitious, but it can't quite reach the ambition. If you can arrive at that kind of judgment and you've shown your work, then that's the kind of criticism that I think people can be proud of. Now, I know, even as I'm cleaning out my thinking, that there are a lot of people who disagree with me who are not going to do any of this. They're not going to affirm that I'm not stupid or evil. They're not going to reach out, engage, and try to teach me. And I am saying right now, it doesn't matter that they're not going to. What other people do has no necessary bearing on what is the correct action for me. That's part of me trying to push the imbalance back toward integrity, even if only a little bit. And I can also say that if I model some of this behavior, that's the place to begin. And I have to remind myself over and over again, because this is a flaw that I find, a flaw that I fall prey to. I am not going to let myself feel superior. What I see from people who attack the other end of the spectrum, people who talk dismissively about liberals, or people who talk dismissively about wingnuts, they always do it from a feeling of superiority. What I need to do, what I commit to doing, is to be patient, to consider the other person's well-being my priority. That's what my faith dictates. And as I talked about in the first episode, that's also about my own well-being. That's about my own self-preservation. That's about the fact that my health doesn't end at my skin. My health extends outward into the health of my community. And the final thing I have to say here is, wearing down alienation and rejection and hatred, that's not a new problem. I started this podcast and I recorded the first episode on Martin Luther King Day. And that's the challenge he faced. And he had a lot to say about love and about soul force. And about love not as being some sort of sit back and daydream about the person you have a crush on, but that love is actually exhausting. And that loving people, loving your enemies, loving those who hate you, that is a commitment that is not for the faint of heart. And that's something that requires a lot of stamina, and that's something that requires a lot of strategy and reflection and even mindfulness, which is another episode that's coming up. So that is where I begin with my housekeeping of my thoughts about criticism. I think I've got to do criticism better, and I've got to hope that a day may come when all of us commit to doing criticism better.